Hey everyone, welcome to Dark Dossier. Before we dive into the video, comment your city down below. I wanna see where you're all tuning in from. And don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe so you never miss out. Let's get started. Story 1. The Postman's Paper Trail. How a postal clerk exposed a counterfeit empire. The year was 1927. The air in central Pennsylvania was cold, and the monotony of post-war life had fully set in. In the small town of Mifflintown, population just under 2,000, the rhythm of daily life moved at a pace perfectly suited for someone like Calvin Brody. You wouldn't remember Calvin if you passed him in the street. He wore brown on brown, hat tilted ever so slightly, shoes polished with care. His job? Postal clerk. Nothing grand, just the front counter at the Mifflintown post office. Every day he sorted mail, checked stamps, and greeted each local by name. But one winter morning in December, something unusual caught Calvin's eye. A package, nothing odd in that. But it wasn't the box itself that stirred something inside him. It was the sender's label, G. Halpern, Brooklyn, NY. That name had appeared once before. And the return address, a warehouse lot Calvin had quietly made note of last week for a different parcel, identical in weight, identical in handwriting, different name. It didn't take much to raise suspicion. Calvin was, by all accounts, a man of minute details. He logged oddities in a little leather notebook he kept tucked under the counter between a stack of outdated postal bulletins. That day he made a note: Deck 12, package 3 pounds, return order, reused, same handwriting. Look for G. Halpern again. At night, Calvin read. While others in town listened to the radio or drank rye behind locked parlors, Calvin flipped through the Postal Bulletin, federal notices, and occasionally the New York Times. It wasn't so much the news that drew him in, it was the patterns. The little mentions of currency crimes, mail fraud, and oddities that mirrored his own findings. The packages from G. Halpern came more frequently. Then another name, A. Dressner. Different handwriting this time, but the same Brooklyn return address. The town's general store clerk, Mr. Embry, mentioned that he'd received one of these parcels, small, unassuming, and had trouble with the enclosed paper notes. Something off about the $10 bill inside, Embry told him. Looked right, felt wrong. Told myself it was wartime ink. Calvin asked to see the bill. The engraving was just slightly off, Jefferson's jawline too soft, the serial numbers spaced oddly. It was a counterfeit. But the strangeness didn't stop there. Calvin started tracking outgoing packages too. Several customers in town were unknowingly forwarding letters and parcels, all bound for small towns across the East Coast. These shipments often followed the same route: Scranton, Elmira, Schroon Lake, even down into West Virginia. The addresses were real. The people receiving them weren't always who they claimed to be. Instead of contacting local authorities, which he worried might overlook such a quiet concern, Calvin wrote directly to the Postal Inspection Service. His letter, dated January 9, 1928, was meticulous and unemotional. Sirs, I believe I have reason to suspect that a postal-based operation involving counterfeit currency and misuse of federal mail systems is using Mifflintown and its surrounding distribution routes as part of a broader criminal channel. I have compiled data, addresses, and parcel records which I will forward upon acknowledgement of this inquiry. Weeks passed with no reply. Calvin kept logging. By early February, the frequency of the suspect parcels increased. He noted 5 in 1 week. At one point, a man he didn't recognize came to collect a parcel but gave the wrong name. Mr. Darris, he claimed, but the package was addressed to L. Finch. The man shrugged and left. Calvin committed the face to memory. Finally, on February 18, a reply came from the Postal Inspection Division in Philadelphia. An inspector by the name of Harold Ennis was assigned. Ennis didn't visit right away. Instead, he asked Calvin to keep tracking, asked for specifics, weights, dates, parcel codes, contents if possible, and he's warned Calvin not to alert the local police. We need to see how far this web stretches, the letter read. Calvin was thrilled not for recognition but for validation. He wasn't a man of ego. He was a man who believed in structure, order, patterns. One package changed everything. It was addressed to a S. Jeller in Troy, New York. Calvin had seen the name once before but never here. The weight, 2 pounds 13 oz, again suspiciously close to others. But this time, when he lightly shifted the box while stamping it, he heard it. The unmistakable rattle of metal against wood. Not coins, not nails, something different. Against protocol, Calvin opened it. Inside, a wooden puzzle box carefully carved with a hidden hinge. Inside that box, a stack of $10 and $20 bills neatly bundled, every single one counterfeit. He resealed it and sent the package forward. Then he called Inspector Ennis. Ennis arrived 3 days later incognito. A traveling furniture appraiser, he said, though locals were skeptical. Ennis brought tools, UV light, ink analysis kits, fingerprint powder. Calvin helped him in the back room of the post office. They opened 5 more suspicious parcels, all under the radar. Each one contained counterfeits, but more than that, each one had the faint smell of ink solvent, chemical residue. They were fresh. How was this massive operation involving printing, cutting, packaging, and mailing being conducted without tipping off law enforcement or banks? Why did Mifflintown become a key distribution point? And who or what was operating at the center of it all? Inspector Harold Ennis, calm and methodical, carried the weight of 20 years in the Postal Inspection Service. His face was marked with the creases of late nights and long trails gone cold. But this case intrigued him, not because it was flashy. It was. No one had died. No safes were blown. No Bonnie and Clyde shootouts. Instead, it was too clean. Over coffee in Calvin Brody's kitchen, the only place private enough for honest conversation, Ennis laid out the depth of what he suspected. This isn't just one guy in a basement press, he said. It's layered. Whoever's behind this has at least 4 things: access to high-grade printing equipment, distribution routes that avoid scrutiny, clean drop addresses, and people willing to be invisible. Calvin poured another cup. Invisible people, he repeated, looking out the window toward the snowy quiet of Mifflintown. Seems like half this town fits that bill. The print mystery. In the following days, Ennis and Calvin traced parcel codes, not just those sent from Mifflintown, but those received. Surprisingly, more than a dozen locals had received unrequested packages over the past few months. Some thought it was a mix-up. Others figured it was a relative sending something they forgot they mentioned. None of them questioned it. Inside these parcels, often just a book or newspaper, but Ennis suspected they were cover shipments decoys that tested addresses or acted as confirmation points. The real shipments, the ones Calvin had started identifying weeks prior, contained counterfeit money, often sandwiched between mundane items, folded linens, catalog pages, or false bottom boxes. Back in Brooklyn, Ennis began digging into the return addresses. The warehouse listed for G. Halpern had burned down 2 years prior. The lot was vacant. Others were linked to shell companies. One even listed under a children's piano store that hadn't operated since 1919. The common denominator wasn't the sender, it was the parcel route. All of it filtered through small post offices in overlooked towns where shipments didn't attract attention. Mifflintown, with its perfect record of no postal irregularities in 35 years, was ideal. The woman with no record. One evening, Calvin spotted her. She stood near the depot, wearing a thick gray coat and cloche hat, speaking with a young delivery boy. She handed him a package unmarked with a small tip. He nodded, tucked it into his bicycle basket, and rode off. Calvin followed at a distance, not wanting to spook her. She waited 5 minutes, then turned the other direction, walking slowly through Market Street, stopping once to adjust her hat. But she didn't go into any shops. She didn't make conversation. And eventually, she walked out of town altogether toward the state highway. That night, Calvin described her to Ennis in full detail. The inspector looked at his notebook and said, "That's our first human thread." A few days later, the woman reappeared. This time, she brought 3 parcels. They were dropped at different spots, one with a grocer, one at a boarding house mailbox, and the third directly through the side slot at the post office after hours. Calvin and Ennis retrieved them under the cover of darkness. Each was packed the same way, paper-wrapped, double-glued, with the same faint chemical scent. One had a false label with a Chicago address. Ennis took fingerprints using a glassine overlay, a technique still experimental but gaining ground. Results wouldn't come for weeks, but they needed more. The confession of the printer. By late March, a new thread emerged from Elmira, New York. A man named Joseph Langley, a print technician at a small commercial press, had been arrested for passing counterfeit bills at a rail depot. While the bills matched the broader style of the known counterfeits, Langley's version lacked the precision of those Calvin and Ennis had seen. Ennis traveled to Elmira. What he learned reframed the entire case. Langley, under pressure, confessed, not to being the mastermind, but to being a subcontractor. "They gave me plates," he said, "not the originals, just molds. I was paid to run off a set amount and then they vanished. They sent a woman dark coat, said her name was Belle. She dropped envelopes in my box, sometimes cash, sometimes instructions." Langley claimed he was one of 5 printers, each operating under similar conditions, none knowing the others, each given partial tools and separate tasks. A decentralized criminal operation with its own quality control and audit process. He drew sketches, gave names of materials. One sheet he identified had been chemically aged using potassium permanganate, an oxidizing agent. The scent Calvin had noticed, explained. But the most important detail, Langley mentioned a male handler, someone inside the system who arranged for safe drop points and rerouting strategies. And that changed everything. If the group had inside access to postal data, distribution schedules, or even just passive cooperation from rural clerks, it explained how hundreds of counterfeit parcels could move coast to coast with minimal interference. Ennis returned to Mifflintown with a list of known or suspected postal workers who had suddenly resigned, transferred, or died under unclear circumstances in the past 2 years. One name stood out: Harlan Meeks, a former route manager from Scranton who had vanished in 1925 after claiming retirement. A letter from that year showed Meeks had moved to Virginia. A second letter never sent was found in Langley's recovered belongings. It was addressed to H.M., care of S. Geller, Troy. That same S. Geller had been a known recipient in Calvin's earlier tracking. The factory in the forest. Based on travel records, Ennis narrowed possible hideouts to abandoned properties between Scranton and Binghamton. In early April, a field inspection uncovered a small woodworking factory long since listed as bankrupt. The site, once used for piano casings, had an operational generator and recently used press equipment, complete with drying racks and boxes of linen-based paper stock. But the place was clean, too clean. Whoever had operated there had cleared out days before. Ennis found one thing left behind: a 1913 silver coin drilled and hollowed out. Inside, a micro-roll of paper with parcel weights and postal codes, all of them traced back to towns like Mifflintown, Troy, and Easton. The breakdown of a network. By late spring, the operation began to unravel. Postal agents in Maine and Delaware reported intercepted parcels. A banker in Schroon Lake raised a red flag about serial number duplications. Eventually, arrests were made in West Virginia and Rhode Island, all low-level couriers or blind shippers, most claiming to know nothing about the larger structure. Still, Belle, the woman in the gray coat, remained unidentified. In Mifflintown, Calvin was both relieved and unsettled. The town had gone from invisible to integral in the unraveling of one of the largest decentralized counterfeiting rings of the 1920s. Yet so many questions remained. What was the full extent of the operation's reach? How many towns had unknowingly served as conduits? And where had the masterminds gone? Ennis believed they had only touched the outer shell. The core, the one who designed the system, was still out there. This wasn't some back alley setup, he told Calvin. This was infrastructure, a shadow network, hidden inside the ordinary. By early summer of 1928, the counterfeiting operation's edges had frayed, but the core remained maddeningly intact. Across 5 states, scattered arrests pointed to a highly structured yet decentralized criminal enterprise. The Postal Inspection Service had pieced together maps of distribution hubs, drop points, and indirect couriers. But the architect of the operation had disappeared, evaporated like steam from a morning cup. In Mifflin Town, Calvin Brody continued logging suspicious mail, though the volume had dropped sharply. Fewer strange parcels. No return of the mysterious woman in gray. To most residents, the whole affair remained invisible. No headlines, no sirens. Just quiet disappearances like steam, like whispers. But for Calvin, everything had changed. His days now included whispered conversations with federal agents, mailroom inspections, and distant trials where he was called to testify as an observant federal witness. The arrest that was. In July, Ennis received word from a contact in Albany. A woman matching Bell's description had been detained for questioning after attempting to pick up a package at a general store using a forged receipt. The woman gave her name as Clara Bellman, claimed she was a freelance distributor for a catalog company, and had paperwork neatly printed, laminated, and entirely fake. Her fingerprints were partial but inconclusive. The address on her ID, a burned-out boarding house in Newark. She was released for lack of evidence. Ennis rushed to Albany the same day. He reviewed the store's security footage, grainy, at best, and obtained the parcel she'd tried to collect. Inside were carefully folded newspaper clippings and layers of cardboard. Beneath them, bundles of counterfeit 20s, all marked with identical serial numbers to bills recovered in Elmira. By the time Ennis tried to redetain the woman, she was gone, left the city within hours of release. At this point, Ennis acknowledged a hard truth. The mastermind might never have existed as one person. It may be a role passed, shared, restructured, a design rather than a designer. The breakthrough in Baltimore. The next major development came not from Mifflin Town or Albany, but Baltimore. In August, a low-level postal worker was arrested for internal mail theft. His locker revealed thousands in counterfeit bills, letters written in code, and a contact book with only first names Bell, Sloan, Griggs, M. More importantly, one scribbled note caught Ennis's attention. See Brody equals OBS. Watch post. Do not interfere. The clerk had no idea who had written the note or where it had come from. He claimed the contact book was given to him by someone in a train station lavatory in Philadelphia. This marked something chilling. Calvin had been known to the ring, watched, possibly protected. He wasn't just stumbling across them. He had become a variable in their calculations. Calvin's reaction. When Ennis told Calvin what had been found, the clerk simply nodded, his hands steady but his face drained of color. "It means they knew I was onto them," he said, "and they let me keep going. They could have buried me in anonymity. One small-town clerk disappearing. It happens. But they didn't." And he's offered to relocate him temporarily. Witness protection wasn't formalized yet, but temporary relocations, new names, were within the service's means. Calvin declined. "No, I started it here. I finish it here." He was promoted quietly to lead postmaster that fall. The locals never asked questions. They saw Calvin as they always had, neat, polite, reliable. Only the new lock on the post office's backroom door suggested a deeper story. The long fade. In the months that followed, cases sputtered. Most of the counterfeit bills had been recovered or filtered out through banking alerts. New patterns of fraud emerged, but none matching the scale or precision of the 1927-28 operation. A formal report was compiled by the Postal Inspection Service, circulated internally under the heading, "The Mifflintown Distribution Model: Lessons in Decentralized Crime." The report outlined how a group or collective had used rural routes, invisible workers, psychological manipulation, and administrative blind spots to run a $500,000 counterfeit ring, adjusted for modern inflation, nearly $8 million. It detailed the failure of traditional enforcement models to detect quiet fraud, emphasizing the need for local vigilance. At the center of the case, one line stood out. Had it not been for the meticulous observations of Postal Clerk C. Brody, this operation might have continued for years without detection. The final parcel. In late October, weeks after the case was considered concluded, Calvin received one final parcel. It bore no return address. The handwriting was unfamiliar, the paper lightly scented with lavender, a stark contrast to the chemical smell that once marked the counterfeit packages. Inside was a single book, The Art of Disappearance, a pulp novel published in 1912 about a master of disguise and forgery. Tucked inside the front cover was a handwritten note. To the observer, you played well. May you never need to open your ledger again. B. No signature, just that initial. Calvin didn't report the letter. He burned the packaging in his fireplace, kept the book locked in a drawer. He never saw Belle again. The ripple effect. Though the public never knew the full story, the Postal Inspection Service made quiet changes after the case. Random audits were expanded to include rural branches. Cross-referencing of package origins and drop patterns became standard practice. Postal workers were trained to identify behavior-based irregularities, not just physical signs of fraud. More importantly, the agency began recruiting differently. It started looking for people like Calvin, those who saw patterns, noticed inconsistencies, and asked the quiet questions others overlooked. Calvin, for his part, stayed in Mifflintown another 20 years. He retired in 1949, having never taken a sick day. Locals said he loved crossword puzzles and early morning walks. No one ever asked about the briefcase he carried home each night or the ledger he kept tucked in his kitchen drawer, even after retirement. When he died in 1962, his niece found the notebook, the original one. Yellowed pages, written in precise block letters, parcel codes, addresses, oddities. The final page bore only one sentence. In small things the truth hides. Reflection, the crime that was loud. The story of Calvin Brody and the 1920s counterfeit ring is not a tale of violence or media spectacle. No shootouts, no high-speed chases, no confessions shouted from witness stands. Instead, it is a story of quiet observation, of persistence without reward, of one man's refusal to dismiss the odd details everyone else ignored. In a world of spectacular crime, it was a boring case until it was. It challenged law enforcement to look beyond noise and consider what might hide in the margins. It asked, how many other Calvin Brodys saw something, said nothing, and let the quiet networks flourish? And perhaps the more important question still lingers. If Belle never left, if she simply changed names again, how many small-town clerks are, even now, unknowingly part of a design they can't see? Story 2, The Quiet Burglar of Boise, a janitor's double life. On a chilly March morning in 1973, the Boise County Clerk's office opened at 8:00 a.m. as it always did. At 8:17 a.m., Lisa Vaughn, a junior administrator, went to grab a supply inventory from the janitor's closet. She didn't find her usual list of mop refills or floor polish requests. Instead, she noticed a clipboard half tucked behind a stack of cardboard boxes with notes not in her handwriting, nor in the handwriting of the janitor, Jim Layton. The notes were unusual. Names, dates, building addresses, not official county buildings, private residences, and businesses. Some had check marks beside them. Others were underlined in red. She left it on the supervisor's desk, not thinking much of it. But the following morning, the clipboard was gone. When she asked Jim about it, he paused longer than necessary. "I clean a dozen buildings a week," he said, eyes not meeting hers. "Probably just an old work list. You can toss it." But Lisa didn't. She quietly mentioned it to her supervisor, who passed it up the chain. Within a week, the county building's night shift janitorial logs were quietly reviewed, not just for Jim Layton, but for everyone on contract. That's when something strange began to emerge. Over the last year, Jim had requested access to a wider range of buildings than usual. Utility offices, school annexes, even the basement of the state insurance board. Nothing had ever gone missing, and nothing had ever been broken into. But here was the strange part: some of the addresses he'd cleaned. They didn't have janitorial contracts at all. A ghost on the clock. Jim Layton, 52, was known by nearly everyone in the Boise civic building circuit. Soft-spoken, nearly invisible, he was the kind of man who held doors, waved kindly from his rusted station wagon, and once donated 50 cents to a vending machine that shorted someone. He'd been working as a part-time janitor for the city since 1968. His personnel file was spotless. Not a single write-up. Never took sick days. Always brought his own lunch, a thermos of black coffee and a bologna sandwich, every day without fail. But when two auditors began to look deeper into the logs, something didn't add up. Buildings that reported no cleaning activity at all had completed checkouts in Jim's name. Others had cleaning done on nights when they were allegedly closed. That triggered a larger question. If Jim was entering buildings he wasn't assigned to clean, why hadn't anything been reported stolen? A security review of a city records annex where Jim had supposedly cleaned revealed a fault in the alarm system. Motion detectors on the second floor had been disabled likely months earlier. No one had noticed. The cleaning reports for those nights, signed only by Jim. A pattern emerges. As the months passed, a quiet but steady review of keyless entry logs, building check-ins, and property logs began to focus on one thing. The pattern of access matched a peculiar rhythm, not random, not entirely opportunistic. Instead, Jim appeared to be revisiting buildings that housed either financial departments, like tax assessors' offices, legal record storage, such as family court archives, utility accounts, especially water, sewer, and zoning records. The hypothesis was unnerving. Jim wasn't stealing physical items. He was copying information. The city lacked modern surveillance at the time, but one department had begun piloting a 16 reel-to-reel camera system mostly to track employee theft of supplies. A grainy frame from one of these cameras showed a figure entering a basement filing room on a night when no janitorial staff were scheduled. The timestamp matched Jim's keycard entry, though he never reported cleaning that room. But to what end? There was still no evidence of stolen money, no signs of external burglary. But when a retired sheriff named Al Sanderson was looped in as a consultant more out of curiosity than formal procedure, he said something that changed the tone of the investigation. "This guy isn't taking, he's planning. This is a casing operation. He's building a ledger of vulnerabilities." Indeed, a search of public reports showed that in the last 3 years, 5 Boise area homes had been burglarized with strange similarities. No forced entry, only personal documents or safe contents missing not TVs or jewelry. None of the stolen items had serials or recoverable markers. In 3 of the cases, the homes were owned by employees of buildings Jim cleaned. But Jim had never been connected to any of them. That changed when a sheriff's deputy followed Jim one Friday evening off the clock. Jim drove not home but to a suburban neighborhood in Garden City, parked half a block away, and sat for over an hour. No movement, no binoculars, no camera, just waiting. Then as night fell, he drove away. The quiet confrontation. When Jim was brought in for questioning informally at first, he didn't deny being at the Garden City neighborhood. He claimed he was visiting a friend, but couldn't give a name. When asked about his building access logs, he simply replied, "I clean what I'm told. Sometimes schedules get crossed. I just do the job." Then came the turning point. Investigators presented a photocopy of the clipboard notes Lisa Vaughn had originally found. What he said next caught them off guard. "You shouldn't have seen that," he whispered, not threatening, more disappointed. Asked what the notes meant, Jim only smiled slightly. "It's just numbers and names. Nobody got hurt." With no clear evidence of a crime, he was released. But an unofficial surveillance was authorized through a quiet coordination between the sheriff's office and the Boise City inspector. That night they followed Jim again. This time, he drove toward an industrial part of town, parked beside a dry cleaning warehouse, and entered with a key. He stayed inside for nearly 2 hours. When he exited, he was carrying a locked box and a stack of folders. Police stopped him 3 blocks away. The box contained maps, circuit diagrams, access points, detailed lists of employee schedules, alarm cycles, and property vulnerabilities for over 40 buildings across Idaho and Oregon. None had been burglarized yet. What was Jim building? Jim Layton was arrested for trespassing and unlawful possession of restricted municipal records. But what unraveled over the next month startled even seasoned law enforcement. In his home, a 2-bedroom bungalow outfitted like a minimalist library, police found typewritten dossiers of hundreds of buildings, blueprints, stolen or copied, of private and public properties, 17 labeled manila folders titled Optimal Access Points. No cash, no weapons, no stolen goods. It was a heist plan, not for one building, for dozens. The assumption was that Jim had been operating for someone part of a network, but months of federal inquiries turned up nothing. No known associates, no signs of communication. When asked about it, Jim's response was eerily calm. "I just like knowing how things work, where the seams are, what no one watches." He was charged and convicted on counts related to illegal surveillance, unauthorized data possession, and trespassing. But with no theft, no violent crime, and no identified co-conspirators, he served just 22 months in state prison. The public never learned most of the story. The files were sealed after Jim's sentencing, quietly archived under administrative discretion. Unanswered questions. When Jim was released, he left Idaho. No record of where he moved, no social security filings since. Some believe he died, others think he may have gone underground. But the folders, those careful blueprints, left one central question open. Was Jim Layton ever planning to steal anything at all? Or was he simply fascinated by how theft could be orchestrated without being noticed? And the most chilling thought, if he wasn't working for someone else, what was he waiting for? Jim Layton had become a ghost in plain sight. Following his 1975 release from the Idaho State Correctional Institution, he left no forwarding address. His driver's license expired and was never renewed. His Social Security activity stopped. There were no utilities, no lease applications, no bank records. Officially, he vanished. Unofficially, he lived on in files, in whispered hallway conversations, and in the hushed paranoia of Boise city officials who never quite got over how close they'd come to something. But to this day, no one knows what that something really was. The files left behind. While Jim himself disappeared, the legacy of his work did not. The 17 folders found in his bungalow were quietly reviewed by a joint Task Force A group comprised of county officials, Boise police, and 2 federal observers from the Department of the Treasury. Why Treasury? Because among the folders was a series of documents analyzing Federal Reserve courier routes with disturbing precision. Jim had mapped every stop, every timing buffer, and every local street detour used during snowstorms or high-traffic holidays. He had drawn potential interference points with overlapping success probability ratings. The margins were filled with neat, block-style handwriting mathematical formulas for likelihood of response, time-to-access charts, and contingency plans for law enforcement arrival based on zone density. The kicker: none of these routes were public. The contingency room. At the back of Jim's house was a locked pantry. Behind a false wall crafted with carpentry skill, far above what his janitorial resume suggested, was what the police informally dubbed the contingency room. It wasn't a place filled with tools or cash. Instead, it contained a hand-built scale model of downtown Boise made from foam and matchsticks, red thread connecting building rooftops and alleyways, a set of index cards, each nomming a building, its shift changes, and what time sunlight hit the south-facing window, presumably to understand visibility. Detectives were stunned. There were no signs of mental illness, no incoherent ramblings, no cult behavior, and nothing outwardly aggressive or hostile. What emerged instead was a psychological portrait of a man with overwhelming cognitive structure, someone deeply interested in the architecture of possibility. No plan is a waste. During his initial interrogation back in 1974, one of the detectives had asked Jim, offhandedly, why he was collecting all this data. His reply: "No plan is a waste. Even if you never use it, the planning itself tells you what others have missed." The statement had seemed abstract at the time, but reviewing it after his release and subsequent disappearance gave it new meaning. Some in the task force began to argue that Jim had no intention of committing any crime at all. Rather, he was an observer who sought mastery over vulnerability. Perhaps he was a failed architect, maybe a disillusioned soldier from an intelligence background. His military record was clean but suspiciously empty for a man of his age. The insurance files. 6 months after Jim's release, another clue surfaced. A private insurance adjuster doing a routine file audit noticed a strange submission dated 1971. It was an anonymous insurance inquiry, requesting coverage quotes for potential losses sustained in non-destructive facility intrusion. The request had been mailed from Boise, signed only with the initials JL. Among the documents enclosed were maps of bank floor plans, fire exits, and safe makes and models, all requested under the guise of structural risk assessments. The adjuster flagged the file and quietly sent it to Boise PD, who traced the postmark to a P.O. box that had long since expired. That P.O. box, according to internal records, had been registered under a cleaning supply company, one with no business license, no inventory records, and one listed manager, James Layton. The theory of the phantom mentor. This discovery reignited interest in the case. Some investigators developed a theory: Jim was training someone. He wasn't planning to commit the crimes himself. He was building a handbook, a step-by-step system of penetration analysis and silent access. The folders, the models, the observations, they weren't for personal use. They were instructional. But for whom? No one had ever visited his home. No neighbors recalled seeing anyone enter or leave. No handwriting was found on the materials other than Jim's. No fingerprints. No indication of outside communication. His phone records were empty, not disconnected, but simply unused. Copycats or coincidence? In 1979, a quiet suburb near Spokane, Washington reported a string of highly professional burglaries. Over the course of 3 months, 4 small-town banks were robbed. Entry was clean, non-destructive. Alarm systems were either bypassed or had inexplicably failed. No cameras caught the intruder. Each theft occurred during the 90-minute window when the bank's night guard rotated between locations. The methods bore striking resemblance to what Jim had outlined in Boise. But no one was ever caught. And nothing connected it directly to Jim. No DNA, no signatures, no calling card. Still, among investigators, the incident became known informally as Layton's Echo. The janitor's book. Then, in 1983, another piece of the puzzle emerged, one wrapped in anonymity. A self-published booklet, mailed in plain brown envelopes to various law enforcement agencies and private security firms, arrived with no return address. Its title: Invisible Architecture, a Study in Silent Entry. The book, 94 pages long, was printed on cheap stock and bound with 2 metal brads. It bore no author credit, but the contents were eerily familiar. It included step-by-step guides on exploiting janitorial access, techniques for identifying blind spots in surveillance infrastructure, timing patterns for city record offices and their vulnerabilities, a detailed guide on casing by compliance, convincing people to give you access simply by appearing like you belong. Investigators compared several passages to Jim's known notes. Phrasing matched. Even the typewriter used, an Olympia SM9, matched the one recovered from his house. But there was no way to prove Jim had sent the book. The trail again went cold. Did Jim ever steal anything? To this day, there's no evidence that Jim Layton ever took $1 from anyone. He never broke a lock, hurt a person, or damaged property. His crime, if you could call it, that was seeing too much, too clearly. He studied institutions with the diligence of an engineer, but through the eyes of someone who could, if he chose, dismantle them. When law enforcement officials reflect on the case today, many express a quiet reverence. He didn't just case buildings, he cased systems, said one former Treasury agent. He looked at how we structured our trust in people, in procedures, and he poked the soft spots. Jim Layton might have been the quietest burglar in American history, or maybe not a burglar at all. The final traces. In 1989, a police officer in Coeur d'Alene reported a small event. A building code inspector had noticed a strange man walking the perimeter of a new municipal library. When approached, he claimed to be a night maintenance supervisor checking the architecture. He had no ID, left without conflict, and was never seen again. But the inspector remembered one thing clearly. The man carried a clipboard. On it, a detailed sketch of the library's rear loading dock. Could it have been Jim? Or was it someone else trained, mentored, or simply inspired? The inevitable question. In the end, Jim Layton's story is not about what was stolen, but what could have been. How much damage could one man do, with only a clipboard, a flashlight, and time? How many cities have their own Jims, unnoticed, quietly walking through doors left unlocked not by force but by neglect? And how many buildings, offices, and homes today still believe they're secure, simply because no one has yet tried? There are crimes that make the news loud, violent, dramatic. They shake communities and demand explanation. Then there are the others, quiet crimes, or sometimes just the blueprints of potential crimes, acts that whisper rather than shout, unsettling us not with what happened, but with what could have. Jim Layton's life hovered somewhere in that second category. Aftermath and inheritance. Following the publication of Invisible Architecture, law enforcement across the Pacific Northwest began re-examining cold cases, burglaries, infiltrations, odd thefts of paperwork, rather than property, hoping to find a link to Layton. Nothing definitive emerged, but scattered across police logs from Washington, Oregon, Montana, and even Northern California, a pattern began to flicker. In small cities, anonymous letters had been mailed to mayors, city clerks, or fire marshals, warning of blind spots in surveillance systems, gaps in lock protocols, or staff vulnerabilities. Sometimes the warnings came before a break-in, sometimes after, but still, before the incident was ever made public. The language was always formal, clinical, and eerily familiar to those who'd read Jim's notes. Each was signed only with a set of initials, or a strange symbol, a square inside a circle. Was it Jim, acting from a new identity? Or was someone else continuing the work? The city that changed quietly. In Boise, the aftermath of Jim's exposure rippled through city planning and policy. It didn't make headlines, most citizens never heard his name, but internally, a quiet shift began. Janitorial contracts were restructured, requiring third-party oversight. Night access permissions became rotational and monitored. Clerical storage rooms were moved to above-ground levels and required two-person sign-ins. And perhaps most striking of all, Boise implemented a vulnerability audit team, inspired unofficially by Jim's methodologies. They didn't use his name, but many of the inspection checklists were built using insights gathered from his seized files. In a strange twist of fate, the man who might have stolen everything ended up improving the very system he studied. The investigators' final conclusions. By 1995, most officials who worked the Layton case had retired or moved on. But in a rare round-table meeting, closed door, and off the record, 5 of them gathered to reflect on what had haunted them for 2 decades. Their summary: Jim Layton was more analyst than criminal. His obsession was not wealth, but flaw-finding. He operated alone, likely due to an intrinsic distrust of others, perhaps a product of a deeply private or possibly institutional past. He may have prevented more crimes than he ever planned simply by being seen, questioned, and revealed before any operation could unfold. But the question that lingered, unspoken until the final minutes of their meeting, was this: did Jim ever succeed at something no one discovered? Was there one building, one vault, one disappearance of documents that was too perfect, too undetectable for anyone to trace back? The room was silent. Then one of the agents said quietly, "If there was, we wouldn't know, would we?" The house that watched. In 1998, a Boise couple purchased Jim Layton's old bungalow. The false wall had long been removed, but traces remained, marks on the floor from heavy tables, faint outlines of cork boards where pushpins had once hung, and a strange notch in the wall behind the refrigerator, where a cable line had been routed not for television, but for a custom-built surveillance loop. The new owners occasionally reported oddities, muffled creaks in the attic, unexplained flickering of lights when their home security was active. Nothing sinister, just small, disorienting glitches. One winter, they found a tiny plastic case under the floorboards during a renovation. Inside was a microfilm reel, unmarked. They sent it to a lab. The contents were degraded, most of the frames were unreadable, but a few held clear images. Hand-drawn blueprints of the Idaho State Treasury Vault, circa 1966. A list of keyholder names, accurate to that year. A final frame, a single sentence typed in white text on black background. "A place watched is a place made safe for you, or for me." The couple turned it over to local authorities. No one ever followed up. Jim Layton's quiet legacy. Today, Jim's name rarely surfaces, not in textbooks, not in documentaries, but in specialized law enforcement training modules. There's an occasional mention of latent-type auditing, a behavioral category given to individuals who study systems with criminal-grade precision, but may never commit a single illegal act. Cybersecurity specialists now study similar patterns in modern threats. Hackers who infiltrate without deploying malware. Individuals who map out corporate systems just to see if they could. Analysts who predict disaster routes not for rescue, but for the knowledge of how panic spreads. Leighton's ghost, whether he still lives or not, hovers over these quiet threats. He was perhaps a prototype for a new kind of criminal, the one who never breaks in but who could, and makes sure you know that. The final report. In a dusty archive in Boise, still sealed by confidentiality agreements and accessible only by court order, is a file titled James E. Leighton, Behavioral Risk Profile, Closed Case, Uncharged Intentions. The last page of the file contains a handwritten note by the chief investigator, added just before his retirement. This man taught me something terrifying, that the greatest threat isn't always the man who breaks the window. It's the one who learns how long it stays unlocked before anyone notices. Reflection, a crime without theft. Jim Leighton never stole a single item. But his case reminds us that some crimes live not in action, but in the intention left unspoken. That an unlocked door, a quiet hallway, and an unchecked clipboard can become, in the right hands, a key not to a vault, but to everything we assume is safe because it's quiet. He never made noise. And that silence may have been the most dangerous part of all. Story 3. The Strange Case of the Library Ledger Thief. For decades, the Grand Marlow Public Library stood unchanged. Built in 1912 in the heart of Connecticut's sleepy Litchfield County, it was the kind of red brick relic that smelled of aging paper, oiled wood, and quiet. The kind of place where the loudest sound most afternoons was the creak of the floor beneath the reference desk. No one had ever considered it a place for crime. So when the budget came up short by only a few $100s in early 1991, the library director, Margaret Hobbs, chalked it up to clerical error. Something in the quarterly reporting, probably. A misfiled invoice. An overpaid vendor. But the next quarter came. Then the next. And each time the shortfall grew not dramatically but steadily. $318 in Q1. $542 in Q2. $760 in Q3. All unaccounted for. All amounts too small to trigger a formal audit by the town board, but enough to give Margaret pause. She reviewed receipts, checked the checkbook stubs, tracked vendor payments. Everything seemed normal, and yet the numbers refused to reconcile. Then in November, the circulation desk's petty cash fund came up $47 short. That was different. Cash was counted weekly. It was never supposed to be off. Margaret asked her assistant to check the logbook. Maybe someone had used the money for postage or to buy coffee for a visiting speaker, but there were no notations, no sign that the drawer had even been opened. That's when Margaret decided to take the matter to the town treasurer, not because she thought a crime had been committed, but because something was wrong and had been for a while. A quiet pattern of disappearance. The treasurer, a young man named Alex Bertram, took an interest immediately. He'd always had a soft spot for the library. It was where he'd studied as a teenager, and where his mother had worked in the children's section for nearly 20 years before she passed. Alex didn't start with the books, he started with the receipts. And that's when he noticed something peculiar. All the vendor receipts were accounted for, but a handful of them were handwritten, not printed, for things like laminating film, archival folders, binding glue, barcodes for new books. Margaret insisted she hadn't seen these orders come in, but the invoices had her initials or something close to them. a curling M with a squiggle that looked more like a spiral than a signature. Still, the items weren't there. Alex asked to check the order history with their primary library vendor, a small distribution house based in Hartford. Their records showed no such orders. Someone had forged the invoices. The ledger room. Grand Marlow Library kept a small, climate-controlled room for historical town ledgers, voting rolls, probate files, and land transaction records dating back to the 1800s. The room required a staff key and a separate sign-in sheet for visitors. It also had a donation box. And that's where the next clue surfaced. A local retiree named Helen Garvey had been quietly donating $10 a week in cash to the library since the 1970s. A small act of civic duty, never questioned. But in December of 1991, she happened to mention to Margaret in passing, "Oh, I dropped off my envelope in the usual spot. Hope it helps with the ledger restoration." Margaret froze. The donation box hadn't had anything in it for months. She checked it herself, empty, no envelope, which meant someone had been intercepting it regularly. The box itself was locked, but the tiny brass key hadn't been accounted for in years. Anyone with a copy or a bit of lockpicking knowledge could have accessed it easily. Margaret called Alex. Together, they began to pull visitor logs from the ledger room. That's when the same name started to repeat, week after week, sometimes twice a week. Vincent Clay. Who was Vincent Clay? Vincent had been volunteering at the library for nearly 6 years. Never a staff member, just someone who showed up reliably, always in the mornings, always wearing brown corduroy and a patched elbow jacket. A former teacher, supposedly, said he liked to be useful. He shelved books, reorganized card catalogs, helped older patrons use the microfilm machine. He was unremarkable, polite, quiet, meticulous. Until now, no one had connected his name to anything unusual. But when Alex pulled the visitor logs for the ledger room, Vincent's name appeared 47 times over the past 18 months, more than any other non-staff individual. He always signed in, always signed out, but no one remembered why he was down there so often. When Margaret confronted him gently the following week, he smiled. "I just like the quiet," he said, "and the history." He left early that day and never returned. The strange deposit trail. Alex expanded his search to local banks. Though banking privacy limited what he could access, he was able to confirm one thing. A Vincent Clay had been depositing odd amounts of cash, always under $200 every 2 to 3 weeks. It wasn't illegal, but it was enough to raise suspicion. A subpoena revealed that Clay had opened a modest savings account 3 years prior and had accumulated just over $9,000 in small deposits. Further investigation revealed that Vincent Clay was not his real name. His birth name was Caleb V. Rawlins, a former city clerk in Bridgeport who had been quietly fired in 1983 for inconsistencies in materials management. No charges had ever been filed. The matter was handled internally. After that, he drifted, holding odd jobs, always around books, records, or filing systems. A subtle operation. What unfolded over the next 2 months was a quiet internal audit, led by Alex, and a state librarian appointed by the Department of Historical Preservation. They discovered nearly $12,000 missing from donations, petty cash, and expense padding all over the course of 5-7 years. Dozens of falsified invoices that had allowed Clay to skim funds quietly. Hand-altered inventory logs, suggesting he may have borrowed rare books including 3 first-edition state histories without ever returning them. A hidden drawer in the archive room containing rubber stamps, fake invoice headers, and library check stubs. But the most unusual thing they found: a handwritten ledger, kept in precise calligraphy, listing every item he had ever removed or considered removing from the library. Next to each entry was a rating system. C for copyable, O for original, P for potentially valuable, R for replaceable. He had categorized the entire library's collection by vulnerability. But why? Caleb Rawlins, aka Vincent Clay, was arrested without incident in January of 1992. He didn't deny any of the charges. In fact, he seemed relieved. "I didn't want to ruin anything," he told the arresting officer. "I just thought it shouldn't be so easy." During his interview, he admitted to never selling any of the rare books. They were stored in a weather-sealed trunk in his attic, along with the rubber stamps and false invoice templates. He claimed he had only kept the money to see how long it would take someone to notice. It had taken nearly 7 years. The town's quiet reckoning. In the end, Caleb was charged with misappropriation of funds, forgery, and unlawful possession of historical materials. He served 2 years in minimum security. The town chose not to publicize the incident widely, fearing it would dissuade donors and hurt the library's reputation. But internally, things changed. All cash donations moved to a locked, staff-only drop box. Inventory logs were digitized. Volunteer access was more tightly controlled. Margaret retired in 1995. In her final report to the board, she included one sentence that stood out among the bureaucratic jargon. "We failed to see that quiet can be as deceptive as it is comforting." Unresolved thought. As for Caleb or Vincent, no one knows what happened after his release. He moved to Vermont briefly, then vanished again. His actions never reached the level of major fraud or grand larceny, yet what haunted many was not the amount he stole, but how elegantly he did it with pen and ink, with old keys and older habits, with nothing more than time and trust. He once told a librarian during his volunteer stint, "Books aren't the only things that go missing slowly, people do too." And perhaps that was the point. After Caleb Rawlins, known to Grand Marlowe as Vincent Clay, was taken into custody, the small-town library fell into an uneasy calm. It wasn't scandal that disturbed the staff and trustees most, but something else entirely. It was the realization that he had always been there in the background, polite, helpful, trustworthy. And still, none of them had really seen him. Inside Caleb's mind. In the days following his arrest, authorities cataloged the items seized from Caleb's attic. The list was long but subtle. 3 out-of-print Connecticut historical almanacs from the early 1900s. A bound voter registry from 1859. Handwritten meeting notes from the town's original council stored in glassine sleeves. 5 cash ledger books with dates ranging from 1985 to 1991. Photocopies of internal library, budget, reports, some of which were supposed to have been destroyed. A small tin box of coins from library donation jars, each labeled by date. And most curious of all, a leather-bound journal thick with pages, densely written in a fine black ink. Investigators assumed it was a diary. But it was a kind of audit narrative, a methodical documentation of the library's weak points. The journal of a passive intruder. The journal began with an unassuming entry from April 3, 1985. "I've watched how they secure the ledgers. No cameras, no checks, just trust. They don't count the donations weekly. There's no system for auditing petty cash, not really. There's room here, space in the margins." From there, the entries progressed from mere observations to structured testing. Envelope drop tests. He described quietly removing Helen Garvey's donations for several weeks before returning one just to see if the routine would reestablish itself. Forgery trials. He detailed practicing Margaret's signature until he could replicate it from muscle memory. Stockroom swaps. He moved archival supply orders from one shelf to another, noting how long it took staff to notice. Sometimes weeks, sometimes never. But the journal wasn't celebratory. It wasn't a trophy case. It was a map, a behavioral analysis of trust in public institutions. He was chronicling not theft, but fragility. The expert who reviewed the journal. The Connecticut State Library Board brought in a forensic archivist to examine the materials, suspecting Caleb might have stolen more than he admitted. The archivist, Ann Verlander, had read countless criminal files in her career, but this one stopped her cold. This man wasn't just stealing, she later said. He was studying vulnerability as an art form. He treated access like literature. Every gesture meant something. She described the journal as almost meditative, filled with lines like, "They never count the number of archival folders. Staff rotate on Fridays. No one double-checks the supply closet until Monday. It is easier to steal what no one believes is worth watching." It wasn't the work of a criminal mastermind. It was the quiet obsession of someone watching everything no one else did. A town unsettled. By mid-1992, the Grand Marlow Library had replaced every internal lock. Volunteer protocols were rewritten. Every donation was logged in triplicate. New trustees were brought in, including a retired auditor and a compliance officer from a local insurance firm. But none of those actions settled the unease. Because while the town had caught Caleb Rawlins, they still didn't really understand him. Some wondered if he had intended to steal more, if the rare books and documents were a stepping stone to a larger con. But Caleb maintained, even in court, that he never planned to sell a thing. "If something's gone," he told the judge at sentencing, "people look for it. If it's simply misplaced, they forget it ever existed. I never wanted to take. I only wanted to see." It was a statement that sounded more like philosophy than defense. The disappearance of information. Among the documents in Caleb's attic was a box labeled "Discontinued Knowledge." Inside were paper slips, torn from books, with handwritten notes about titles that had been removed from the library's collection, often due to budget cuts, space limitations, or age. Each slip had a summary of the book, what shelf it once occupied, and how long it had been there before it was discarded. Margaret, when shown the box, was stunned. "We don't even keep records of that," she whispered. He made his own archive." Caleb had tracked every lost title. In his view, the library had been slowly deleting parts of itself. And maybe that, more than money or materials, was what had drawn him in. The clay envelope. 6 months after Caleb was sentenced, Margaret received a small padded envelope at her home. The return address was a P.O. box in Vermont. Inside was a single vintage bookmark from 1939, a folded piece of archival linen paper with one sentence written in fountain pen ink. "I never wanted to own what wasn't mine, just to remember what no one else did." There was no signature. Postal investigators confirmed the box had been paid for in cash. There were no fingerprints. It was presumed to be from Caleb. It was also the last anyone ever heard from him. Reflection, the ledger as a mirror. Caleb Rawlins taught Grand Marlow an uncomfortable truth: that systems fail most often not through violence or force, but through absence. Absence of scrutiny, absence of accountability, absence of attention. He was not a thief in the traditional sense. He was a mirror, held up to a system that thought itself too small, too ordinary to be at risk. The money he stole was real. But what lingered longer was the knowledge that no one had been watching. Not because they were lazy or dishonest, but because they trusted the silence. By the time Caleb Rawlins disappeared from Grand Marlow's view, not just physically, but emotionally, culturally, the town had returned to its rhythms. The library reopened its ledger room to researchers, Local patrons resumed their quiet routines, and children once again gathered for story hour beneath the old oak-beamed ceiling. But the shadow Caleb cast never fully lifted, because even after he was gone, what remained was a haunting absence. Not of materials or funds or priceless relics, but of certainty. The final audit. After Caleb's sentencing, the Grand Marlowe Library underwent one last internal audit, this time not for theft or forgery, but to recatalog every item in their historical collection. The audit took 4 months. In the end, the librarians found 6 books that had never been accounted for in any ledger, yet bore the library's stamp. They were tucked deep in the stack rooms, their catalog cards long discarded, as if someone had quietly returned them. Each was listed in Caleb's journal under a category labeled RP, replaceable placement. Some pages were annotated in pencil, in careful, almost reverent handwriting. It wasn't vandalism, it wasn't defacement. It was restoration. He had studied the items not to steal them, but to understand their position in a system that had already begun to forget them. In one book, A Child's History of Connecticut, 1907 edition, a single post-it note was stuck to the inside back cover. The note read, "If knowledge has no guardian, it disappears, slowly, quietly, like breath on glass." A life of margins. Records from Bridgeport, where Caleb was once employed, were revisited years later by a reporter curious about the case. What they found was startling. Before his quiet firing in 1983, Caleb had submitted multiple memos to city officials outlining inefficiencies in city archive storage, improper document preservation, and the destruction of public records without formal review. He was ignored. Some thought he took it personally. Others suspected it was just the beginning of a lifelong obsession with institutional decay. But perhaps it wasn't spite. Perhaps, as some would later suggest, it was grief. Grief for the overlooked. Grief for things that mattered but were never properly counted. The return of Vincent Clay. In 1999, nearly 7 years after Caleb's last known communication, a small library in Barre, Vermont reported a man applying to volunteer under the name Vincent Clay. The head librarian remembered him for his quiet demeanor, his knowledge of book preservation, and his strange fixation on the library's donation system. He never caused trouble, never stole. But after 4 months, he disappeared again, leaving behind a binder labeled Obsolescence Risk. It contained a full audit of the library's most at-risk titles, recommendations for reclassification, and a hand-drawn floor plan redesigned for better archival humidity control. There was no request for payment, no forwarding address, only a note. You'll lose fewer things if you assume everything matters. It was never confirmed that it was Caleb Rawlins, but those who had read his writing felt no doubt. The legacy he didn't intend. Caleb's name would never appear in national news. There were no exposés, no podcasts, no interviews with prison psychologists. His crime was too quiet. His method too dull for headlines. His purpose too ambiguous for TV. But in library science circles, particularly in New England, the Rawlins Protocol is sometimes referenced when designing donation tracking, volunteer oversight, or archival lending procedures. Not formally, not in policy, but whispered as a cautionary tale. Don't build a system Caleb would have found easy. A culture of counting. The strange lesson of the Grand Marlowe Library ledger thief was not just about fraud. It was about the things we trust because they feel too small to be corrupted. The quiet places, the polite volunteers, the $10 donations we assume always arrive. Caleb's methods taught uncomfortable truths. That the space between attention and inattention is where rot begins. That no amount is too small to notice. That someone, somewhere, may be watching the systems we no longer think to question. And if that person is like Caleb, intelligent, deliberate, and patient, the real damage may not be measured in dollars, but in confidence. Margaret's final note. Before her death in 2002, former director Margaret Hobbs gave an interview to the Litchfield County Chronicle. The interview was short, mostly reflecting on her years of service, the joy of watching generations grow up through the library walls. But when the reporter asked about the incident with Caleb, she paused. He saw what we didn't. That trust becomes laziness if left too long alone. I don't forgive what he did, but I think I finally understand why he did it. When asked what she would say if she ever saw him again, she thought a long time. Then replied, "I'd ask him what we still haven't noticed." Reflection when trust sleeps. What makes Caleb Rawlins' case extraordinary is not how much he took, but how long it took anyone to notice he was taking it all. It reminds us that even the quietest corners of public life, the card catalog, the ledger room, the donation box, deserve scrutiny, not because they are suspicious, but because they are vulnerable. The silence of the stacks can conceal more than dust. And sometimes, those who seem to help the most are the ones who know just how much no one else is watching. Story 4. The Milk Bottle Switcheroo. Fraud in a Small-Town Dairy Co-op. When the Pine Hollow Dairy Cooperative was founded in 1946, it was built on one thing: trust. A handshake agreement among farmers from 3 neighboring towns, Cold Creek, Eston, and Belford, to share delivery routes, bottle processing equipment, and revenue from pooled milk sales. For nearly 40 years it worked. Nobody got rich, but everyone got by. Families passed down their roots. The bottling plant employed 3 generations of locals, and the co-op's golden rule, milk in, money out, evenly split, was considered sacrosanct. Until in the summer of 1984, something started to curdle. It began with a taste. The farmer who noticed. Clarence "Red" Holloway had a sharp palate. Not in a gourmet sense, just a lifetime of knowing the difference between skim and whole by scent alone. He ran a mid-sized dairy on the northern end of Cold Creek, supplying about 10% of the co-op's total weekly volume. Every Monday, Red made it a point to drink from a random bottle off his root, part quality control, part habit. One morning in July, something was off. It was flat, he later said, thin, not watered down exactly, but it didn't have the body I was used to, didn't sit right. He didn't think much of it until 2 weeks later, when he noticed a second bottle, this time from the Belford route, that had the same problem. Red had worked with cows long enough to know when something didn't taste like it should. So he made a few quiet calls. The co-op's dirty secret. The Pine Hollow Dairy Co-op had a simple system. Each farm delivered raw milk to the bottling plant on Tuesday and Thursday. Milk was tested for bacteria and fat content, then pooled based on category. Final products were bottled, capped with colored wax seals, blue for whole, green for skim, red for cream, and sent back out for delivery. Monthly revenue was split according to contribution and quality scores. But Red's samples told a different story. He began saving leftover bottles, refrigerating them, and pouring off the cream. Normally, in unhomogenized whole milk, the cream would rise and form a thick top layer, but week by week, the layer got thinner. Either the co-op had started skimming the cream before bottling, or someone was tampering with the process. Red decided to get scientific. Enter the chemistry teacher. Red reached out to Earl Vance, the local high school chemistry teacher and a lifelong Cold Creek resident. Earl was no stranger to makeshift science. He'd once tested soil samples for the town garden club and rigged a backyard weather station from surplus parts. Given 5 bottles, each labeled by date and delivery route, Earl tested. Butterfat percentage, water content, Relative density. Separation rates. The results shocked him. Every single bottle labeled as whole milk had butterfat content below 3.25%, he told Red. One was as low as 2.1%. That's almost borderline skim. According to co-op policy, anything under 3.25% couldn't be sold as whole, which meant someone was either diluting the milk or diverting the cream. Follow the cream. Cream was a valuable byproduct sold to bakeries, cafes, and specialty shops. While whole milk brought in modest revenue, cream sold at a premium. Earl and Red suspected that the co-op was removing more cream than declared, likely under the radar, and selling it separately. But the question was, who? They didn't want to raise suspicion publicly. So Red asked his niece, Lorraine, a part-time clerk at the co-op office, to pull the shipping manifests for external sales. Lorraine found something odd. The co-op's listed weekly cream output was about 280 gallons. But the internal fat test records suggested that it should be closer to 350–360 gallons, given the total milk volume received. That's 70–80 gallons of unaccounted for cream every week. The third route. There were 3 primary routes. Cold Creek, handled by Red and 2 other farms. Eston, 3 smaller dairy farms. Belford, just 2 suppliers, including the co-op chairman himself, Merle Hanlon. Merle was a respected man, former alderman, served in Korea, known for his deep baritone voice and unshakable calm. He was also the one who signed off on all final shipments. Red was careful not to accuse, but he noted that the cream shortages coincided most often with bottling days led by Belford Milk. Earl, curious to dig deeper, visited the plant on a Thursday, posing as a maintenance check-in from the local sanitation board. In small towns, that didn't raise eyebrows. While walking through the bottling area, he noticed something odd. 2 identical cream separators sat side by side. One was logged on the equipment manifest, the other was not. The second unit was clean, almost unused, but connected to a pipe that led behind the plant wall to an unlisted cooler. Earl took photos. The unregistered separator meant someone had added a second cream extraction stage outside of the track process. The switcheroo in action. With help from Lorraine, Earl and Red began analyzing bottle caps, tracking delivery batches from each farm, measuring fill volumes, and correlating them to lab reports. They discovered a pattern. Whole milk from Belford was almost always slightly underweight. Skim from Eston was often slightly over. Cream batch weights didn't add up. On paper, no crime had been committed. The books were balanced, but the product being delivered wasn't the one listed. The co-op was using 2 processes. A visible cream separation, logged, taxed, and paid out. A shadow operation, siphoning a portion of the fat-rich milk through the second separator, bottling extra cream off the books, and diluting the remaining milk to pass as whole. And the profits? Cash-only cream sales to 3 local bakeries and 1 cafe in Riverbridge. Why no one spoke up? It turned out that Merle had been running the secondary cream operation for nearly 4 years. He didn't pocket the money outright. Instead, he used it to pay for co-op repairs without triggering tax liability, fund a secret discretionary fund for emergencies like replacing broken milk chillers or buying new glass bottles when the regular supplier raised prices, occasionally top off short paychecks for drivers who'd missed hours due to illness. It was fraud, but not selfish. Or at least not entirely. No one reported it because everyone had quietly benefited at some point. Red's dilemma. Red was torn. Merle had been like an uncle to him, a mentor, but the ethics didn't sit right. So he approached Merle directly. "You could have told us," Red said. Would you have said yes? Merle asked. Not if it meant lying on paper. Merle didn't deny it. He even admitted the extra separator. I figured as long as the milk got out, the people stayed happy, and we didn't go under. What's the harm? To Merle, it was bending the truth for the greater good. To Red, it was a breach of trust that undermined the very reason the co-op existed. The vote. Red brought the issue to a private meeting of the 7 co-op board members. They reviewed the data. Earl presented his findings. Lorraine backed the manifest inconsistencies. After 3 hours, the board voted 5-2 in favor of shutting down the shadow operation. Merle was asked to step down. The second separator was removed and auctioned. A new tracking system was installed, overseen by Earl. Merle left quietly. He never contested the vote. Unanswered thought. The townspeople never knew the details. The milk tasted fine. The deliveries kept coming. But the co-op's quiet fracture left a lingering question. When rules are bent to hold a community together, is it still theft or is it survival? And if no one notices until the taste changes? How many other good lies have already curdled unnoticed? After Merle Hanlon quietly stepped down from the Pine Hollow Dairy Co-op board, the air in Cold Creek shifted not dramatically but perceptibly. It wasn't scandal in the classic sense. No arrests, no news articles, no shouting in the town square. Just attention. The kind that lingers in small towns like mist over early morning fields. Though the illegal cream operation had ended, the co-op's foundation, once solid as the stone barn walls it operated out of, now felt fragile, and people began to wonder what else had been hidden beneath the froth. The accountant's discovery. Earl Vance, the high school chemistry teacher turned accidental auditor, was officially brought on as the co-op's part-time compliance officer in fall of 1984. His first task: implement a consistent logging system for cream separation and delivery tallies. As he reviewed the backlogs, he noticed an odd irregularity. From 1981 through early 1983, the declared milk contributions from Eston Farms appeared unusually high, especially considering those farms had fewer cows and smaller land bases than their Cold Creek or Belford counterparts. Earl ran the numbers. Eston's farms claimed roughly 24% of the total milk output. In reality, based on herd size and production averages, they should have produced closer to 15–17%. Where was the extra volume coming from? Ghost milk. At first, Earl suspected faulty measurement tools, miscalibrated milk meters, or misread volumes during collection. But when he cross-referenced Eston's weight tickets with the co-op's internal tank records, he found something stranger. Certain tank loads marked as coming from Eston 2 and Eston 4 didn't match any of the actual farm codes on file. They were phantom sources. On paper, it looked like Eston had 4 active member farms. In truth, it only had 2. Someone had added ghost contributors to the log, funneling real milk under false identities, possibly to inflate contributions, and thus claim a larger share of co-op revenue. This manipulation would have affected everyone's payout, especially those in Cold Creek, and the person overseeing distribution for that period. Merle Hanlon. The second fraud. The cream skimming operation had masked a secondary deception. By inflating Eston's volume through ghost contributors, Merle had subtly siphoned a larger revenue share to Belford, his own farm, and the Eston region, where he had property interests. But why layer fraud upon fraud? Earl had a theory. The cream operation was cash profit off the books, quick, untraceable. But the milk volume manipulation was a slow gain, a rebalancing of the payout formula to tip favor toward Merle's side of the county. If no one noticed, or if the books balanced just enough, no alarm would ever ring. And for years it didn't. Red's reluctant return. By now, Red Holloway had become more than just a farmer. His careful sleuthing with Earl had elevated his standing in the co-op, even earning him a seat on the new ethics committee. But Red didn't want power, he wanted answers. He requested a full reconciliation, a retroactive review of payouts over the last 5 years. The findings: $26,000 in overpaid shares to Eston and Belford-linked accounts. Underpayments to Cold Creek farms ranging between $1,000 and $5,000 per farm. The discrepancy was just small enough and spread out over enough time that no individual farmer had caught it. But collectively, it amounted to a betrayal. Merle's response: Red drove out to Merle's farm one evening. No formal confrontation, no reporters, just two men on a porch, surrounded by the hum of dusk and the creak of a rocking chair. "You told me the cream was to keep us afloat," Red said. "It was," Merle replied, "still is." "And the ghost farms?" Merle didn't answer immediately, just stared out over his quiet pasture. Then he spoke. "When Cold Creek nearly dropped below quota in '81, the board almost pulled our second tanker. Would have left Eston and Belford holding the roots. You think we'd have lasted 2 more winters?" Red didn't reply. "I cooked the books," Merle admitted, "but I did it to keep us alive." Red stood in silence for a long while. "You ever think," he finally said, "that maybe if you told the truth, we'd have fixed it together?" Merle only nodded. "Maybe." The vote to forgive. Faced with hard evidence of financial manipulation, the co-op board debated pressing charges. But the outcome was murky. No personal wealth had been hoarded. Funds had been redistributed, not pocketed. And prosecuting Merle meant exposing years of oversight failure that could shake public trust in the entire co-op. Instead, the board voted unanimously to restructure payments. Cold Creek Farms received backdated disbursements. Eston members, some unaware of the fraud, accepted reduced shares for the next 3 years to balance the books. A new auditing system was implemented with outside reviewers. As for Merle, he was officially banned from any administrative position and barred from voting privileges for life. But his milk, clean, well-kept, and consistent, was still welcome. The farmers didn't want to cut off his livelihood. They just couldn't trust his ledger. What's measured, what's missed. Earl, ever the scientist, later reflected in his notes. "We built a system where honesty was assumed, where the numbers matched because no one wanted to check beneath the surface, and for a while the taste of the milk was enough, until it was." He continued his role as compliance officer for another decade, eventually publishing a small internal guide for co-ops titled Integrity Without Enforcement, a cautionary manual. Though never widely distributed, the pamphlet became quietly influential in New England's farming circles. The Cream Cafe. Years later, in 1992, a small cafe opened in Riverbridge called the Cream Line. It specialized in rich coffee, hand-churned butter, and pastries made with, of course, locally sourced cream. The owner, a woman named Lydia Hanlon, Merle's daughter. When asked about the name, she said, "It's the line at the top of the bottle, the part you wait for, but only if you don't shake it too soon." Locals debated whether the cafe was a tribute to Merle's schemes or a reclamation of legacy. Either way, it became a beloved staple. Unresolved thought. Some still argue Merle saved the co-op. Others say he almost ruined it. But perhaps the better question is, what's the line between preservation and manipulation, and who gets to decide when a lie is for the greater good? Because even in the cleanest milk bottle, there's always a place where cream and milk meet, a seam, a blur. And that blur is where the truth tends to hide. Long after the second separator was removed, the books were reconciled, and Merle Hanlon had faded into rural semi-obscurity. The Pine Hollow Dairy Co-op kept running. Cows still needed milking, bottles still needed capping, and the people of Cold Creek, Eston, and Belford still wanted their milk delivered before sunrise. The scandal, if it could be called, that never made it beyond a few coffee shop whispers. There were no reporters, no trials, no dramatic finger-pointing. But in the quiet churn of daily life, something had changed. Not loudly, not visibly, but deeply. A new kind of watchfulness. In the years following the exposure of the twin frauds Cream Siphoning and Ghost contributors, Earl Vance oversaw the implementation of a new, surprisingly elegant auditing system. It didn't rely on computers, which were too expensive for most farms in the 80s. Instead, it centered on transparency through redundancy. Milk volumes were logged 3 times, once by the farmer, once by the collection driver, and once at the co-op weigh station. Random fat content tests were performed weekly and compared across routes. A rotating bottle taste check was introduced, not scientific, but symbolic. One farmer each week sampled a bottle from each route and signed off on its quality. It wasn't foolproof, but it was built on a new assumption: that even trusted systems deserve scrutiny. And in that, the co-op evolved. Not through punishment, but through collective responsibility. Merle's final years. Merle Hanlon stayed on his farm until 1998. He never reapplied to the co-op board, never contested the lifetime ban. When he saw Red Holloway in town, he nodded politely, never seeking conversation but never avoiding it either. He sold milk, nothing more. But those who visited the Hanlon farm noticed something strange in his barn office. A map, yellowed and torn at the corners, showing the original co-op routes from 1946. Marked across the edges in faded red ink were little notations. Cold Creek needs second cooler by spring. Eston Route 2 long consider split. Talk to Red about bottle shortages. It wasn't a map for theft. It was a blueprint for survival. Misguided, certainly, but also deeply earnest. The Holloway File. After Earl Vance retired in 1990, he passed his notes and findings to Red Holloway, now a reluctant but respected leader within the co-op. In the bottom of the folder was a note. You weren't just right, you were early, but truth needs more than proof. It needs someone willing to be the first to say, this doesn't taste like it should. Red kept the folder in his attic. He never shared it publicly, never used it for leverage. But on the day of Merle's funeral, attended by most of Belford, a handful of Cold Creek farmers, and no one from Eston, Red placed a bottle of cream on the casket. Unopened, unshaken, letting the cream rise to the top. The next generation. By the early 2000s, the children and grandchildren of the original co-op members had taken over. Refrigerated trucks replaced milk wagons, bottles gave way to cartons, and the bookkeeping was done on computers with auto-flagging for discrepancies. But the co-op still held to a few old ways. Quarterly tastings by members, route swaps to encourage transparency, public posting of cream output, and revenue splits pinned right next to the weather report at the feed store. The memory of the milk switch never faded entirely. Not out of resentment, but out of reverence for how close they'd come to losing the very thing they all depended on. The hidden notebook. In 2006, a renovation crew clearing out the old bottling barn found a notebook tucked behind a wall beam, sealed in a waxed canvas pouch. It was Merle's handwriting. Inside were years of notes, short, functional, and emotionally restrained. But one page stood out. There's no such thing as just a little off. Not in milk, not in truth. If they catch it in time, it gets poured out. If they don't, it sours the whole batch. I wanted to protect the milk, but I forgot to protect the trust. The board voted to keep the notebook archived but accessible not as evidence, but as memory. Reflections in the cream. There are stories of fraud that destroy institutions. This wasn't one of them. Pine Hollow Dairy Co-op survived not because the fraud wasn't serious, but because the people chose to respond with honesty rather than vengeance. They didn't hide the truth. They processed it. Like milk through a separator, spinning the chaos until the truth could float. Final reflection, the taste test of trust. Merle Hanlon never made off with millions. He didn't buy cars or build empires. His fraud wasn't about greed. It was about control, masked as protection, the belief that a good enough reason could justify bending the rules. But Red knew better, Earl knew better, eventually they all did. Because when the taste goes wrong, when the bottle feels light, or the cream doesn't rise, that's when someone has to say, "This doesn't feel right, and I'm not going to pretend it does." It's a quiet moment, a small crack in a bigger wall. But it's how honest systems begin again. Story 5, The Unnoticed Chemist, Poisoning the Patent System. In the summer of 1961, the U.S. Patent Office flagged an unusual uptick in applications involving chemical preservatives. Most were submitted by corporations, food giants, pharmaceutical firms, industrial suppliers, but one name appeared on nearly 12 separate filings in under 6 months. Dr. Lowell Brennert, a chemical consultant from Springfield, Illinois. He was unknown to the patent examiners. A few had to search internal directories just to verify his background, and even then, there wasn't much to find. He wasn't affiliated with a major university. He hadn't published in major journals. His listed company, Brennert Formulations Limited, had no phone line and no office outside a post office box. But his patent applications were detailed, startlingly so, and written with the sort of technical confidence that usually came from a large research lab. Each one proposed a new chemical process for enhancing the shelf life of food products, using compounds that, on paper, were novel combinations of safe ingredients. Each formula was backed by precise diagrams, chemical equations, and claimed small-batch laboratory testing data. The examiners were impressed, but something about the consistency made them curious. And eventually, that curiosity led to a question that would unravel the quiet work of a man who had built his legacy not on invention, but on deception. A man with no lab. Lowell Brennert lived in a modest rented home on the outskirts of Springfield, across the road from a rail yard. His neighbors remembered him as quiet, polite, and extremely punctual. He left the house each morning at 7:00 a.m., returned at 6:00 p.m., always with a briefcase and a small thermos. He claimed to be consulting with firms in the city, but no one knew which ones. He had no car, walked everywhere, no known family. He paid his rent in money orders, and he never invited anyone inside. But when a field examiner named Paul Hertz decided to verify one of Brennert's process claims by contacting a supposed lab partner listed in the footnotes, he found a strange thing. The lab didn't exist. The address led to an old warehouse that had been vacated in 1959. And when Paul dug further, he found that none of the partners, assistants, or collaborators Brennert listed existed in federal registry systems. At first, this was dismissed as possible clerical error, pseudonyms, outdated addresses. But the applications kept coming, and they were growing more audacious. The preservative that didn't preserve. In October 1961, one of Brennert's filed patents, a compound mix labeled LP407, was quietly licensed by a small regional food processing company in Indiana. The compound was supposed to extend shelf life of processed meat products by up to 21 days without affecting flavor or texture. It had received preliminary approval for limited commercial testing. But within 4 weeks of production, dozens of meat shipments were spoiled, not just expired, but chemically unstable. Several customers reported burns in their mouths after consuming sausage links from one particular batch. Tests showed the compound had reacted with sodium nitrates, creating a mild but corrosive compound. The processor immediately pulled the product and alerted regulators. Brennert's listed data for LP407 had shown no such interaction. When contacted, he claimed the batch must have been contaminated and insisted his lab had tested multiple iterations with no issues. Pressed for lab records, Brennert provided a single typed page, no timestamps, no original logs, no chromatography reports, and the signature of the supposed lab tech. Illegible. The lab that never was. The USDA opened a quiet inquiry. They dispatched a compliance officer, posing as a potential investor, to visit Brennert's listed address for Brennert Formulations Limited. The P.O. box led to a suburban post office where staff had never seen a man named Brennert in person, only envelope drops and pickup slips. Brennert's lab, listed on one tax form, was supposedly located in a converted storefront near the rail yard. But when investigators visited, they found only a boarded-up former dry cleaner, empty for years. There was no lab, no assistants, no equipment, and increasingly, no evidence that any of the patents were based on real testing. The pattern of the papers. The patent office escalated the matter. They reviewed every one of Brennert's filings. A senior examiner, a meticulous chemist named Teresa Holcomb, noticed something unnerving. The structural diagrams of Brennert's chemical processes were legitimate. The terminology was correct. But the compounds proposed were subtly, consistently flawed, always one step away from working. In other words, the patents looked just real enough to pass a cursory review. But they wouldn't survive implementation. They couldn't, because they hadn't been tested. The quiet conman. When finally confronted, Brennert denied wrongdoing. Theoretical patenting is a common academic exercise, he said. Not when it's used to license products for public consumption, Teresa replied. Eventually, under pressure, he admitted. He had no lab. He had no assistants. He had never tested a single compound beyond simple household experiments. He had simply studied chemical literature obsessively, read thousands of papers, taught himself how to structure an application convincingly, and then filed patent after patent, assuming most would be too obscure or too theoretical to ever be tested. He had banked on the backlog of the patent office, and for a time it worked. What he wanted. When asked why he did it, why create a trail of false patents, his answer was chilling in its detachment. Real labs cost millions. I had $50 and a library card. If I filed enough convincing ones, someone would call me a genius, and then maybe I'd have a real lab. He saw it as a form of ambition, not fraud. But that ambition led to contaminated food, violated federal standards, and years of cleanup work for agencies tasked with reviewing dangerous filings. Brennert was charged with filing fraudulent government documents, endangering public health through untested chemical submissions, forgery of scientific credentials. He served 4 years in federal prison. Unanswered thought. After his release in 1967, Brennert disappeared. No public records, no new patents, no listings in scientific registries. But years later, a patent examiner in Ohio came across a new filing, this time for an industrial adhesive. The structure was familiar. The equations had that same polished falsity. And the listed inventor, L.B. Renslow. Was it Brennert, again trying under a new name? The filing was rejected, but the examiners began to wonder. How many other patents, quiet, dusty, never activated, have slipped through? Filed not by criminals, but by unseen minds looking to invent their way into legitimacy without ever touching the science. And in a system built on assumption and overload. What separates the innovator from the imposter? Following Dr. Lowell Brennert's arrest and conviction in 1963, the case file was quietly shelved within the U.S. Patent Office under an internal code. Abstracted misrepresentation, Category B, shorthand for fraudulent applications that had the appearance of scientific legitimacy but lacked any proven basis in experimentation. But the incident raised troubling questions, not just about one man, but about the systems he had exploited so easily. How had a single unaffiliated chemist, working out of a rented apartment with no visible lab, managed to file nearly 24 patent applications, some of which advanced to commercial licensing? The answer, investigators would find, had little to do with chemistry, and everything to do with process manipulation. The pattern behind the patent. After Brennert's conviction, a team of analysts was tasked with reviewing all 23 of his patent applications. While only 2 had been officially approved, many had reached the final stages of examination, one step away from full protection. They shared a set of eerie commonalities. Shared formatting. Each application used nearly identical structures, including boilerplate introductions and repetitive phrasing. Obfuscated citations. He referenced obscure Eastern European chemistry journals, most of which were difficult to source or verify, especially in pre-digital archives. Fabricated collaborators. The names of co-authors and testing technicians were absent from academic registries, and when traced, often belonged to deceased or non-existent individuals. In one case, a supposed lab assistant listed in a 1960 application had died in 1954. This wasn't sloppy forgery. It was calculated camouflage. Inside the apartment laboratory, the arresting officers had expected to find crude lab beakers on a stove, maybe chemical stains in the sink. What they found instead was paper. Stacks of notebooks filled with copied and rewritten chemistry formulas. Library checkout slips dating back over a decade, focused exclusively on chemical engineering, food preservatives, and process patents. A self-constructed filing system sorted by molecule class, reaction pathway, and visual plausibility. An index card labeled acceptable side effects by category, non-lethal, listing known food-safe compounds and their tolerable adulterants. Brennert had clearly never tested these combinations, but he understood how they might look if someone had. His notebooks included entire conversations that never happened, lab notes signed with fake names, photocopies of fabricated data charts, hand-drawn equipment schematics with manufactured wear. In short, a fictional lab made real enough to fool a system designed for good faith. The licensing loophole. Perhaps more shocking than Brennert's manipulation of the patent office was his brief but very real foray into the food industry. Between 1960 and 1961, 3 small processing companies signed temporary licensing agreements for formulas described in his applications. They did so because the patents were in the final stages of approval. Brennert offered extremely low licensing fees, far below market rate. He convinced them the compounds were academic surplus, inventions universities had ignored. These deals were struck with no lab tour, no third-party testing, no formal vetting. In one internal memo, a food company manager wrote, "If even one of these works, we'll beat every shelf-life competitor on the East Coast." None worked. 2 caused spoilage. 1 caused skin irritation in test groups. But the real tragedy was this. The companies didn't initially suspect the formulas were fraudulent. They believed they had made errors in production. It took months before suspicion turned back to Brenner. What he got away with. While the official narrative claims that the system caught Brenner before major harm was done, later internal memos revealed a more sobering reality. At least 5 applications were only withdrawn after his arrest, meaning they sat in circulation for months, potentially influencing other submissions. At least 2 were later cited in foreign patent filings by applicants unaware of their fraudulent origins. And perhaps most concerning, one of his formula schematics was unknowingly used as a reference by a textbook publisher, compiling a section on emerging food additives. Brenner's fingerprints had been embedded in the system ghost traces, contaminating legitimate scientific work. And without his prosecution, they might have stayed there. His prison year. During his 4 years in prison, Brenner was reportedly quiet, compliant, and withdrawn. Guards noted that he often requested access to the prison library's chemistry section. He reportedly read every textbook available, then began rewriting patent abstracts by hand, as if preparing to return to his work upon release. One counselor reported, "He talks about patents like a person talks about novels, not with pride but with possession, like they're stories he created and only he understands." He never admitted wrongdoing. He never apologized. He simply claimed the system should have asked better questions. The ethics of intention. 1 year after his release, a university professor from Michigan who had followed the case closely published an editorial titled "The Brenner Problem." In it, he posed a provocative question. If a man understands a scientific process well enough to describe it convincingly, but not well enough to safely execute it, is he a fraud or a failed innovator? Some defended Brenner as a tragic figure, a man with a brilliant theoretical mind and no access to resources. Others pointed to the spoiled food, the fabricated names, and the forged data. The answer wasn't simple, but the damage was real. The system responds. Following the case, the U.S. Patent Office enacted a set of reforms, informally dubbed the Brenner Safeguards. Mandatory third-party testing for patents involving chemical applications in consumables. Background verification for listed collaborators or lab assistants. Random field audits of applicants with more than 5 filings in a single fiscal year. These were small changes, quiet changes, but they signaled an admission that trust alone is not enough. Not in systems, not in signatures, not in scientific claims typed on official forms. Unresolved thought. Lowell Brenner didn't steal money. He didn't poison a water supply. He didn't run a con for luxury or greed. He simply wanted to be believed. And in doing so, he exposed how much of our progress, our safety, our belief in innovation rests on an unspoken assumption that those who invent actually know what they're doing. So the question lingers. If one man, with no lab, no team, and no oversight, could nearly rewrite a corner of food science using nothing but paper and confidence, how many others already have? When Lowell Brenner walked out of the Federal Correctional Institution in Terre Haute on a gray morning in October 1967, no one met him. No journalists, no family, no colleagues because he had none. Just a man with 2 cardboard boxes, both filled with books on chemistry and law. He left without incident, checked into a budget boarding house under the name Lawrence Bennett, and vanished into the folds of America's middle class, never formally resurfacing again. But his story, like the unstable compounds he invented on paper, kept reacting with the systems he touched slowly, quietly, sometimes dangerously for decades to come. The shadows left behind. In 1972, a research assistant at a small Midwestern chemical firm discovered an internal white paper referencing a Brenner derivation pathway for a preservative formula. The paper had circulated among engineers as a cautionary model of what not to do, avoid theoretical schematics without verification. The assistant flagged it for review. It turned out the paper's core structure mirrored one of Brenner's discarded patent applications. No one in the company knew where it had originated. It had simply entered the firm's document library years before, via a departing consultant. The consultant, a man who had worked briefly as a patent clerk for a subcontractor in 1965 during Brenner's pre-trial hearing. Unwitting contamination. This was the pattern Brenner left behind. Not overt damage, but intellectual residue, fragments of fiction that had drifted into real labs, real offices, and real innovations. And they were nearly impossible to trace. Academic fallout. In 1981, a young chemistry professor at a regional college cited one of Brenner's applications in a class textbook on food-grade preservatives. He had no idea the patent had been withdrawn due to fraud. The citation was clean, the description was logical, the equations appeared sound. It took a doctoral candidate cross-referencing historical fraud cases to catch it. The book was revised in later printings. But the professor admitted in an interview, "It scared me, because it made me realize how easy it is for falsehood to dress itself as scholarship, especially if no one ever questions it." The system forgets, but slowly. By the late 1990s, the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office had digitized most of its archives. In doing so, a small team working on fraud flag metadata rediscovered the Brenner file. Out of curiosity, they reran his applications through the modern evaluation algorithms. To their surprise, 5 of the 23 applications passed the preliminary automatic checks. Why? Because Brenner's errors weren't mathematical. They were epistemic errors in origin, not structure. The formulas made sense, but they weren't based on trials. The diagrams were correct in form but fictional in function. Modern systems had improved oversight, but they still couldn't detect falsehood that looked like innovation. It raised a critical question. How much of our collective technical knowledge is based not on truth, but on repetition? The final glimpse. In 1996, a woman named Claire Darnell, working for a regional public records archive in Ohio, stumbled across a death certificate for a Lowell B. Renner, age 71, deceased from heart failure, no next of kin. The name meant nothing until she saw the occupation. Independent patent consultant. The address was a rented unit above an old pharmacy in Akron. A property manager had found the body after no one saw him for several days. Claire, a part-time historian, dug further. She requested the belongings inventory. Among the items listed, 3 notebooks marked draft formulas, a typewriter, multiple copies of The Chemistry of Preservatives, 1958, and a box of unfiled patent applications, some typed, some handwritten. No applications had ever been submitted under Renner. But Claire, out of academic curiosity, compared a few of the forms to archived Brenner patents. The phrasing matched. The diagrams matched. The errors matched. It was him. Still trying. Reflections from the review board. In 2001, a roundtable of examiners and regulatory officials met for an internal symposium on past fraud cases. Brenner was one of the final cases discussed. A former examiner said, "He wasn't the first to forge data, but he may have been the first to forge credibility as a form of design. He didn't just lie, he architected trust." Another chimed in. What scares me isn't that he fooled us. It's that we still don't have a perfect way to detect someone like him if they came through again today. The room fell quiet, because deep down, everyone knew Brennert hadn't exposed a flaw in science. He had exposed a flaw in the belief that science always polices itself. The man who wanted to matter. There are con men who seek money. There are fraudsters who want power. But Lowell Brennert wanted something stranger. To be included. To be cited. To be remembered. And in a way he was. Not for a discovery, but for the reminder that systems built on good faith must still prepare for the absence of it. Because the illusion of evidence can be as powerful as truth for a time. And if no one looks closely, that time can last long enough to hurt people. Final reflection, when fiction looks like fact. Brennert's crimes weren't splashy. He never made the front page. No trial was broadcast. No memoir was written. But his story lives on in cautionary footnotes, in revised textbooks, in protocols designed to double-check what seems obvious. Because he proved something we're still reckoning with today. That knowledge can be forged. That systems can be tricked. And that belief in credentials, in documentation, in confidence can be manipulated. It starts with a signature, a schematic, a set of formulas typed neatly on white paper. And before long, fiction becomes reference. Unless someone stops to ask, did anyone actually test this? Story 6, The Locksmith's Ledger, Uncracking a Vault Fraud in 1940s Pittsburgh. In the spring of 1947, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, was a city teetering between war-worn industry and a hopeful economic resurgence. Steel mills thundered back to life. Apartment vacancies dwindled. Businesses once again required safe places to store large quantities of cash, war bonds, payroll, and even precious metals. Which is why Federal Storage and Vault Co., a mid-sized private security warehouse nestled in the Strip District, was growing fast. Offering secure lockboxes and long-term vault storage, Federal prided itself on two things: discretion and mechanical redundancy. No electric locks, no magnetic interference, just rows of manual tumbler safes and vaults installed by local craftsmen, guarded by rotating night watchmen and heavy steel. For years it worked, until April 9, 1947. That morning, the vault manager opened Safe 12C, one of the units holding high-value paper currency from a local brewery's quarterly payroll, and found it empty. Gone. All $82,500 in bundled notes, in 1947 currency. There was no sign of forced entry. No tampering with the hinges. No drill marks, no scratches, no debris. And no alarm triggered. A crime without an entry point. Pittsburgh police were immediately called in, along with agents from the Treasury Department. They expected to find the telltale signs of a crude safecrack, a drilled tumbler, a burned lock face, possibly even explosive gel residue. After all, that was the popular tactic in those days. Instead, they found nothing. The outer lock was intact. The inner seal had not been compromised. Even the dust on the safe's internal shelf was undisturbed save for the very rectangular absence of cash bundles. The investigators had no entry, no suspect. And then someone checked the logbook. The ledger that didn't match. Every access to federal storage vaults was recorded in a large leather-bound ledger kept under glass at the front office. Customers signed in. Employees recorded openings, closings, keyholder names, time stamps. The entry for Safe 12, see the night prior, simply read: April 8-10, 15 p.m. keyholder audit check, no item removed. But the log was written in a different hand than usual. Normally, the night shift custodian, Marvin Dorsey, wrote the entries. But this one looked neater, straighter, almost too careful. Marvin, when questioned, insisted he never wrote it. In fact, he said, no one had been scheduled to access 12C that night. No keyholder was authorized. He had done his rounds and nothing seemed amiss. When asked if someone else could have signed in, he hesitated. Only the locksmith, he said quietly. But he hasn't been around in months. The locksmith in the walls. Federal Storage's vaults had been custom installed by a local technician named Felix Riemer, a German-American locksmith in his 60s, known for his quiet demeanor and unmatched technical skill. Riemer was regarded as the kind of man who could open a safe blindfolded or repair a combination lock using only the sound of the tumblers. He had done work for banks, pawn shops, post offices. But he was strange. Kept to himself. Refused assistance, refused upgrades. Used only handwritten notes, no schematics, no blueprints, no electrical tools. He had last been seen at Federal Storage the previous October, performing a routine lubrication of several vault hinges. He had keys, of course, emergency override access for service purposes. But he had signed a bond contract promising to never use those keys for unscheduled purposes. And yet, the paper trail began to point to him. Tracking the ghost, detectives visited Riemer's last known address, a narrow townhouse in Lawrenceville. He wasn't there. The neighbors said he'd left suddenly in March, no forwarding address. His small garage, where he occasionally repaired clocks and safes, had been cleared out. No signs of struggle, just emptiness and a few spare pins used in lock cylinders. They traced him through locksmith supply vendors. Most hadn't seen him in months. But one clerk remembered a recent visit. Riemer had asked about blank key molds, specific to a rare German-made safe model. The clerk said Riemer paid in cash, smiled faintly, and left with 2 cigarette tins filled with brass shavings and graphite powder. Back to the scene. Investigators returned to Federal Storage and began checking the entire building for signs of tampering. That's when they found it. Behind a false maintenance panel, a hollow utility chase between vault chambers, they discovered a makeshift crawlspace, barely 16 inches wide. Inside, wedged behind insulation and conduit, was an old folding stool, a coil of wire, and a small tool rack containing lock picks, shims, and a handheld stethoscope. More tellingly, they found a stubbed cigarette wedged in a pipe sleeve. Riemer didn't smoke, but the Stubbs brand, Fehlmann Gold, a rare German brand. Imported. Investigators realized Riemer had likely entered the building under cover of darkness, accessed the maintenance crawlspace, and let himself into the vault using a duplicate key, bypassing alarms and entry logs. But how? The genius and simplicity. In a quiet office at the back of the facility, detectives opened the technician's file. Riemer's work orders, his maintenance reports, and buried beneath them, a hand-drawn sketch of the internal gear structure of the vault's rotary lock systems. He had annotated weak points, friction zones, leverage limits, all written in shorthand that, to anyone else, looked like inventory. The horrifying conclusion was now inescapable. He had built a vault system only he could unmake. He knew the mechanical redundancies. He knew when the guards rotated. He knew which safe was most likely to be full, the quarterly payroll safe, and when. And he waited until the vault was most vulnerable. Then he let himself in, removed only the contents of 12C, and left everything else untouched to avoid suspicion. No fingerprints, no witnesses. Despite this near-certain profile, there were no fingerprints left behind. Riemer had always worked with gloves. No witnesses saw him enter or leave the building. The facility had no exterior cameras. He had signed no new leases under his name, no bank deposits, no new car purchases. He was gone. It was the perfect crime, not because it was undetectable, but because every detail had been designed years before the crime was committed. He had embedded his escape route inside the very systems others thought were secure. Unresolved thought. By 1949, the case was declared cold. The money was never recovered. Felix Riemer was never charged, never seen, never proven guilty. Just a missing. And yet every lock he ever installed remained in use for years, some still in service today, in outdated buildings across the Rust Belt. And so investigators asked the only question that mattered. If a locksmith can design a vault only he can open, who exactly is keeping us safe? And what if someone else was watching and learning from him? By late 1949, the theft at Federal Storage and Vault Co. had become something of a whispered legend among Pittsburgh's financial community. Not for its scale, the loss of $82,500, while significant, was not catastrophic, but for its impenetrable execution. No suspect had been charged. No evidence had turned up beyond the crawlspace in some faint sketches. The company, while embarrassed, had upgraded its vault systems and resumed operations. The police, quietly exhausted, had moved on to more immediate crimes. But the case never truly died. Because in the years that followed, small, nearly identical thefts began surfacing. Not in Pittsburgh, but in Cincinnati, Buffalo, Toledo, Louisville. All within the Midwest corridor. All involving privately held vault facilities. All executed without signs of entry. The pattern repeats. Between 1949 and 1953, 6 regional vault companies reported small-scale losses under similar circumstances. 1 or 2 safe boxes emptied. No signs of drilling, cutting, or external tampering. Access logs intact. No alarm triggers. In each case, an internal technician had previously serviced the locks or vault chambers within 18 months of the theft. And in 4 of the cases, investigators noted something chilling. A handwritten maintenance report filed by a locksmith named either F. Riener or Felix R., both aliases untraceable through any known locksmith union or licensing board. The handwriting in these reports bore the same sharp verticals and careful symmetry as the ledger entry from Pittsburgh's 1947 case. It couldn't be coincidence. The quiet work of a watchmaker. Former FBI agent Paul Dandridge, who joined the Bureau's Fraud and Property Crimes Unit in 1952, later wrote about this case in an unpublished memoir. In it, he described Riemer as a ghost who walked in broad daylight, not because no one could see him, but because no one thought to look. His greatest tool was not a pick, or a file, or a shim. It was institutional complacency. The vault companies trusted their in-house service contractors. They never imagined a man hired to repair a lock would be the one charting how to bypass it. Dandridge began collecting all reports bearing similar technical jargon and penmanship. They shared unusual terminology, byte calibration instead of pin depth, dial integrity margin, or listener dead zone. These weren't standard locksmith terms. They were Riemer's personal code. Dandridge created a timeline. Across 6 years in 4 states, the same specter moved from vault to vault, and always left before the job was detected. A safe with no combination. In 1955, a breakthrough came not through law enforcement, but through insurance. A forensic adjuster working for the Continental Insurers Group in Cleveland was auditing a claim for vault losses at Paragon Security Depot, a private holding firm. He compared the facility's mechanical blueprints to the maintenance notes on file. That's when he noticed something odd. One of the lock models in use, a rare European dial model, had no listed US distributor. Where had they acquired it? The answer: Reamer. He had sourced surplus models during WWII recovery programs, claiming they were cheaper and sturdier. But what no one realized was that Reamer was the only technician in the US who knew how to service those models. Even the companies who installed them had limited instructions, which meant, essentially, he created locks that only he could open and only he could fix. It was security by exclusivity and manipulation. The missing apprentice. Dandridge's investigation took a strange turn when he interviewed an aging safe mechanic in Dayton, Ohio. The man remembered Reamer. He recalled meeting him once in 1948 when he came into town to repair a faulty bank safe. But what stood out wasn't the work, it was the young man traveling with him. Reamer, despite his usual solitary reputation, had brought along an assistant. A tall, quiet man in his 20s, introduced only as Charlie. He rarely spoke, carried the tool bags, watched carefully but never touched anything. When asked what happened to him, the mechanic shrugged. Gone, same as the old man, but I got the sense he was learning. This introduced a new theory. Had Reamer trained a protege? Was Charlie the one continuing the heists? Or had Reamer simply multiplied himself not through identity theft or disguise, but by passing on a method? The ledger resurfaces. In 1956, the original Federal Storage Vault log, the leather-bound ledger, was finally returned to evidence. It had sat in a storage crate for years. When re-examined by analysts, they noticed faint indentations on the reverse side of the page that had recorded the 12C entry. Using forensic light filtering, they uncovered a second note written lightly in pencil before being erased. Time 10, 11 silence confirmed C keyed delay 6M confirmed sound lock drift. No one at the company wrote like this. It was not meant to be seen. It was Reamer's own note, likely left as a test message, a field log of sorts. A habit only a methodical technician would bother to record. This confirmed the theory that Reamer hadn't just executed a theft, he had documented it. For himself, perhaps for others, learning from a criminal craftsman. By 1959, a formal white paper was circulated within law enforcement and bank regulation agencies titled Security Integrity Compromise via Maintenance Access, Case Study of F. Reamer. It outlined the risks of long-term service technician access, poorly documented lock model imports, and the blind trust placed in mechanical experts. It recommended regular rekeying of critical vaults after third-party maintenance, mandatory multiple technician teams for sensitive repairs, tracking of rare model imports, and custom override mechanisms. Though never made public, this document quietly changed how banks and storage firms handled physical security. Reamer had never been caught, but his ghost shaped policy. Unresolved thought. No one knows how many vaults Reamer, or those he may have trained, ultimately breached. No list of victims was ever completed. Most companies, embarrassed or compensated by insurers, never filed public reports. And as locks evolved, as keypads replaced dials, Reamer's unique knowledge became outdated, or so we like to believe. But the question remains: if a man could hide within your security system, not by breaking it, but by building it,